Okay, welcome back everyone to the first session. As we kick off, we have an hour and a half this morning to talk about the role of regional organisations in the Pacific with respect to managing the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our panellists for this morning. Firstly, Professor Steve Vertuva from Canterbury University, Georgia Witta, Auckland University, and online on Zoom, coming in from Suva, is Terio Koronawa from the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. So, without any further ado, so that we allow ample time for a discussion and Q&A, I am going to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Vertuva, this morning.
Okay.
Yes, you, sir.
Microphone working?
It is, so be careful what you say.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So nice to be back in you of the COVID hit us, and we were stuck wherever we were. And nice to meet some new faces, Meg, and a few others here. Now, we don't have much time. I think we have 8 minutes. You told us that we cannot go over 8 minutes.
No, we can't.
Yeah, awesome. But earlier on, they spoke 15 minutes each. Yeah. Now, we're supposed to be looking at the role of regional organizations in particular forum. So all the questions will go to Mac, who's ready to be open arms to receive your question. Now, in the morning, a couple of things I heard. One is the intersection between strategic security and human security. It became even obvious in the case of COVID-19. Now, let me take us back and look at the big picture here. When COVID struck, I put together a team of researchers and we put together a book on social protection for COVID, published by Paul Grave Macmillan. And in the introduction, I talked about the securitization of COVID. And the title had to do with, it was the War of the Worlds Revisited. Some of you may remember George Orwell's book and made into a film on War of the Worlds, where these aliens, they came and attacked Earth. The entire security resources of planet Earth was being mobilized to respond to these aliens coming in. And interestingly, despite using guns and everything else available in those days, all it took was this little pathogen, this little virus to kill these aliens. And if you flip it over, you have this virus coming, and we're using our entire resources as a planet, kind of almost like a replay of the War of the Worlds. And one of the interesting observations from the beginning, in fact, our team was working on that as well, is the securitization of COVID, the militarization of terms like the enemy that we have to combat, and the war of the virus. And the militaries were being mobilized in Europe, in the US, certainly in the Pacific, like Fiji, and so forth. So it was framed in the same context as the big, if you like, the enemy in a war. Now, there are a number of interesting observations that you can get from there. One is the way in which the narratives of strategic security was being used in this context of human security, and where the line became very, very blurred indeed, as the resources of the military, the resources of the state, of regional organizations, of world international organizations began to be channeled towards the COVID-19. Now, and of course, it fed into the geopolitical dynamics of the time, the securitization of geopolitics and of COVID in the form of xenophobia, for instance. China was identified as the enemy in the virus, the China virus, and so forth, and that became another layer of the securitization process. Now, and what we also saw around the world was the magnification of some of the existing stereotypes and subconscious biases towards particular countries in the world, particularly in the global south. One of the narratives coming out was that the Western countries are much more well equipped and not so much in global south poor countries. But if you saw what happened, it was actually the reverse. A lot of the countries in the global south did much better than those in the global north. And just before the virus, in 2019, there was a global report by a team of international scientists and medical experts, where they came up with the index of preparedness towards the pandemic. And the US was seen as the most prepared. When the virus struck, then they realized it was probably one of the most ill-prepared countries in the world in terms of that. So there's a lot of narratives and counter-narrative in that security space in relation to that intersection between the strategic and the human security. Now let me go to the point why we're sitting here, and that is look at what about the Pacific. Now, the impact of COVID in the Pacific was amazingly the same as everywhere else in the world. The collapse of the market economy in different ways. Tourism, those who rely on tourism, like Fiji and Cook Islands and Samoa and so forth, that was really hit hard, and the closure of borders and so forth. And a lot of Pacific people were stuck wherever they were, and so they had to work hard how to get back home. And one of the things which saved a lot of Pacific communities was to do with the if you like, the revival of what anthropologists call the social solidarity economy, where they gone back to the land, to the basic survival means of redistribution, of reciprocity, of community generation of resources within the communities themselves, the exchange of goods, which there's a new economy in Fiji, the barter system, which operated and spread to other parts of the Pacific. That is at the local level. And then you have governments who are not able, in many ways, to respond because of the lack of social protection mechanisms. Social protection has been one of the big gaps in terms of human security in the Pacific, because it needs a lot of money. And Australia and New Zealand had to respond by providing cash for budgetary purposes and also for direct social protection, engagement within the communities. Now, the impact was not only economic, it was also psychological, the trauma. A lot of research done on big events, like whether it's to do with the slavery, whether it's to do with other traumatic events in history, is the way in which it can become genetically transformative and becomes intergenerational. And that's one thing about a team with MFAT, which is funded by MFAT in New Zealand. We're looking at that as well in terms of the long-term impact of climate crisis on the Pacific people. Now, COVID had the same impact. People in the Pacific still harbor some of the impact of climate crisis, and how do we address some of those? Now, at the regional level, there's a lot of activities taking place. The forum, for instance, the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway, COVID-19, which Meg was very much involved in. And although the forum itself, because a lot of the employees were locked away at home, so that everything was done in the digital cyber world. The meetings of leaders and the meetings of the foreign ministers and of officials were all done online. And so that kind of transformed not only the communication, but also the relationships and the institutional capacity and strength of the regional organizations. Because when it goes virtual, it's the first time that the resources and the capacity were stretched to the limit, and how they were able to respond was very much limited by the what the digital and the cyber world can afford. Now, so the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway was to do with how they can respond effectively in relation to aid to the Pacific, vaccination, and monetary aid, and other economic and social means of ensuring the survival of a lot of communities. And the Economic Recovery Task Force was also set up together with the Task Force on Socioeconomic Impact. And So all these things were happening. Meg and I think our friend from the forum, we will talk about that in much more detail. But at the same time, a number of regional organizations like SPC, for instance, was very much, because SPC has a very embedded health department. It's been there for a long time. And they have been played a very important role in information in terms of how many countries have COVID-19. If you want to know anything about what's happening around the Pacific, just go to their website and they give you, even up until now, an update on what's happening in the Pacific in terms of the spread of the virus. And international organizations, the World Trade Organization, the European Union, not the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, the Trade, WTO will do anything. And the World Health Organization, European Union, the UNDP, ILO will also be involved in terms of working together with the regional organization. So it was very much a consolidated global and regional effort in many ways. And one of the things which I observed as well was the way in which the COVID-19 has produced both the best and the worst in human beings. The worst in terms of how pharmaceutical corporations were able to make so much money without giving the intellectual property to the global south countries to produce their own vaccination. And the great thing which happened was the way in which the human value of cooperation came into play, particularly in the Pacific, and the way organizations and also within the community were able to respond as part of the human security adaptation to the crisis. Now, last but not least, 1 minute, sorry. Let me talk for 1 minute. A lot of organizations, civil side organizations, and a lot of also regional groupings, such as to do with immigration and custom, and the police and the military, they're also involved, but behind the scene, in terms of working together and ensuring things were happening in the way which was supposed to happen in relation to a collective response to the COVID-19. Now, post-COVID-19, in fact, it's not quite post yet. We're not sure when this thing will happen or will finish. Economies had gone through so much, and a lot of rethinking about what is the way forward in terms of the kind of economic system which can sustain human security, which can sustain communities which are resilient and which are sustainable in the long run in the Pacific. What they have found out was that the market economy has its own limitations. Is there a way to make sure that different kinds of economic models that can be used for sustainability in the future? And some groups have been working on that. The team which I've been involved with has been looking at not only economic sustainability, use of human security, because COVID has provided the space for us to rethink very, very deeply about what kind of security lenses are we going to use in relation to the future. Security does change. The circumstances do change. And how we respond must also change in a way which is not only effective technically, but also with added value of equity, of gender equity, of diversity, of inclusion, because what COVID-19 has done was to exclude a lot of people. The poor people getting poorer, and a lot of women and those who are vulnerable were excluded even further as a result of what was happening at that time. So rethinking about the future, rethinking about security, not only conceptualizations, but also program should include some of those values, apart from the technical and the professional approach. I'll probably finish there. I see Alice looking at me, telling me, can you please shut up at some point?
Professor, I think, thank you so much for your comments, and there's a lot to unpack there, and particularly in terms of some of the lessons for regional coordination around climate change, particularly that have come out of the pandemic, but as well as the intersection with human security too. So lots of food for thought. But if we could turn now, please, to Georgia, if you wouldn't mind speaking next. Thank you.
Kia ora ma koutou katoa, ko Georgia te anō te tuku ingoa no Rarotonga au, ko Ararangi tuku oire. I te ara, e kauono ana au te University of Auckland, Aotearoa, me oku arataki oki, ko Dr. Rowangi Shui, me ko Associate Professor Sir Colin Tukuitonga. So hello everyone, my name is Georgia and I'm a final year medical student from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And I'm speaking to you today on behalf of my research group, which includes Dr. Rowangi and also Associate Professor Sir Colin, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, but they have sent me. So over the last year, we were working as a research group to conduct some research about health security threats in the Pacific Islands. And this ranged from things like climate change and cyber security, but at the forefront of this, of course, was COVID-19. And how it impacted our nations. Global health challenges are evolving at a speed that no country has really seen before, and also no country is exempt from this impact. This COVID-19 pandemic has been a stark reminder of the importance of regional and global action for protecting the health of individuals and livelihoods. And when we were looking about the impacts of COVID-19, we saw that there was the direct impacts, being what did this virus do to the health of individuals, but also the indirect impacts of it, which included things that happened as a result of our reactions and actions to the pandemic. And so when we're considering COVID-19, we have to consider all of these effects and how we can learn from them. So to start off, in March of 2020, around the start of the pandemic, the Pacific Islands Forum enforced the Bukatawa Declaration to ensure that we were going to have a regional approach to tackle this pandemic. And as spoken about earlier, under the Blue Pacific narrative, it's recognised that we have a regional identity, solidarity, and also the centrality of our moana, or our ocean, that connects us, and it means we have a shared responsibility for the health of humans, but also the health of our environment. Our Pacific values were demonstrated by our leaders when they chose to have an approach that was used to protect the health and lives of our peoples predominantly, understanding that there would be social, economical impacts later on. So in terms of what regional organisations did as a response to this, we had the Council of Regional Organisations of the Pacific, or CROP, that has been instrumental in providing this regional support to deliver a united response. It includes groups such as SPC and PIF, and these groups highlighted the effectiveness of when we use scientifically backed information to deliver a regional response to a huge global challenge. One of the initiatives, as discussed, was the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway of COVID-19, and this was used to ensure that there was appropriate and ongoing medical and humanitarian aid supplied to our whole regions. And because of the beautiful expanse of our moana, or our ocean, we had the benefit of sort of geographical isolation, which helped in this airborne virus, but also it provided a bit of a hindrance when we had those border issues and when we have vast expanses of islands scattered and we need to ensure that everyone is brought along in the journey. So the PHPC had protocols surrounding customs and biosecurity, clearances, repatriation, and supplementation of medical supplies in order to ensure there was equitable and safe assistance provided to our whole community. Of course, throughout the pandemic, because it was a global issue, we had global corporations such as larger governments, organisations, foreign affairs teams, who have significant resources and knowledge to offer. But what our regional corporations did is they helped to adapt this so that we had these overarching corporations like the WHO who wanted to provide help, but we had to ensure that it was helpful for our Pacific countries and our Pacific people specifically. So one example was the WHO Pacific through the COVID-19 Joint Incident Management Team, who were used to assess the needs of the communities and help deliver those resources. And so an essential part of our regional organisations was the assessment and delivery of these resources that was tailored specifically to our diverse group of nations, our communities and our people. Another benefit of our regional cooperations is that throughout the pandemic, recognising that COVID-19 was a big and serious threat, but also identified that there are some very long-standing threats in our Pacific Island countries that need to continue to be considered. Some things considering were like climate change and non-communicable diseases, diseases such as hypertension, diabetes and heart disease. It is often said that climate change and non-communicable disease are referred to as the Pacific's twin crises, and they've been long-standing and they are ongoing. In addition to this, it was well known that in the Pacific region we have some of the highest prevalence and burden of non-communicable disease, and we are at some of the greatest impacts of climate change. Therefore, the vulnerability of NCD sufferers was further exacerbated during the pandemic, given the high rates of death of patients with NCD comorbidities. So one vital aspect of the COVID-19 response at a regional level was the recognition of these ongoing burdens and the recognition that we need to continue to strengthen and support our healthcare systems and our economic systems to remain resilient to a wide variety of threats, not just a virus. This includes adhering to traditional work such as the NCD Roadmap Report and the Pacific Legislative Framework for NCDs. The impact of a threat to a system, one depends on the severity of the threat or the strength of it, such as the virulence of a virus or the strength of a cyclone, but also it depends on the ability of that system to absorb and adapt to the impact. And throughout ongoing environmental issues like climate change and all these new diseases we've never seen, we can't always predict what those threats are going to be and how strong they're going to be, but we can continue to reinforce our healthcare systems so that no matter what the threat is, we have an ability to adapt to it. And the resilience of healthcare systems, some things that can be done is ensuring that we have appropriate training of our healthcare workforce in a variety of professions, ensuring that we train them and they come back to the Pacific Islands or they work with the Pacific Islands, infrastructure and being able to assess the needs of a community and then deliver appropriate healthcare to that community. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been a sharp reminder of the importance of regionalism in controlling disease outbreaks and also preparing for future threats. Lessons learned are very palpable. In the Pacific region, particularly Polynesia, it was highly effective in containing the virus, and that's what was discussed just before. And so this is a testament to the established and respected coordinating and technical advising teams that was working within our communities. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, Georgia, you're bang on 8 minutes, so thank you very much for your presentation, and again, loads of questions there around lessons learned, actually, particularly with those twin crises of climate and NCDs. We're going to turn now to Suva to hear from Te Reo Koronawa at the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Well, Terry, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Anna. To your fellow family. The workshop organizers and also the participants that are sitting in the room. I understand that Dave McPhail is also sitting in the room. So I just want to the same to you, Dave Mc. If I known that you were sitting in the audience today, I would have just requested Anna to request you to take the presentation. But thank you for the invite and also for allowing the Pacific Forum Secretariat to be a part of this conversation. Now first, before I go into the Pacific humanitarian pathway of COVID-19 in terms of the regional response, I just wish to reflect on two of the issues that both the panelists have spoken before me and highlighted, and that was on the socio-economic impact assessment task force and also the COVID economic recovery task force. Just to highlight that SEA had undertaken a very comprehensive analysis of the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 when COVID-19 was happening, and the report is now available online. That highlights some of the impact that COVID-19 was having within the region, and also drove a lot of the policy initiatives that we had undertaken in terms of our regional response to COVID-19. Now, with regards to the COVID economic recovery task force, that is now transitioned to be called the Pacific Economic Community, not taking into consideration the key learnings from CERT. The Pacific Economic Community is currently working on the development of a Blue Pacific economic strategy that will drive the economic efforts of the region, collective economic efforts of the region moving forward. But moving back again, and before I start, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Atuba and Georgia for their very thought-provoking opening remarks to the session. I must say, a very hard act to follow, but my purpose here today is to present a practitioner's perspective in terms of the region's collective response to COVID-19, which was known as the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway for COVID-19. So the focus of my opening remarks today will be on the importance of delivering partnership in the regional response. So just by way of background, in March 2020, COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and the declaration of COVID-19 as a global pandemic had unprecedented political, socio-economic, and security implications, which required urgent national and collective actions within the region. The exceptional response measures and restrictions which were put in place by foreign members had the unintended consequence of impacting the ease of movements of medical and humanitarian assistance to and across the region. Now, the immediate need across the region at the time was to ensure that our members' requests for medical and humanitarian assistance needs could be met by the regional and international community in a timely, safe, effective, and equitable manner. Now, in April 2020, the then Fifth Secretary General, who is sitting among us today, consulted foreign leaders who agreed to invoke the Piquetá Declaration, given the prioritization of human security and humanitarian assistance under the Declaration, to provide the basis for regional response to COVID-19. So the Secretariat, in partnership with a number of the regional, international, and technical agencies, developed the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway for COVID-19, or PHPC, which was considered and endorsed by foreign ministers on the 17th of June 2020. Now, a ministerial action group was established to provide political oversight and supported by a regional task force to oversee the development of the relevant protocols and the operationalization of the PHPC. Now, as alluded to earlier, part of the protocol was developed to help facilitate the implementation, which includes the deployment of protocol and the deployment of technical personnel, immigration protocols, customs protocols, repatriation protocols, and also a specific protocol on diplomatic clearances for flights within the region. Now, the purpose of the protocols, in addition to ensuring that we are able to provide timely assistance to our members, was to ensure that the PHPC itself does not become a vessel of transmission of the virus to foreign countries. Now, just as an update, since August 2020, the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway for COVID-19 had undertaken over 50 flights, delivering over 380 metric tons of health and humanitarian supplies, and moving over 157 technical health and humanitarian personnel across the region during the lockdown. So, in addition to strengthening the resilience of foreign members against COVID-19, the PHPC had also played an important role in responding to disasters, including the TCS assistances to Fiji and Vanuatu in December 2020, response to Typhoon Sergei in Palau in April 2021, the installation and repair of desalination plants for Tuvalu in December 2021, and lastly, 2 flights earlier this year to assist with ongoing drought in Kiribati. So the PHPC was a global first, and the political settlement of the establishment of the the PHPC was achieved in record time, just over 3 months. I just want to emphasize that without multi-stakeholder collaboration, the PHPC would not have been possible. There were several challenges faced during the establishment of the and the implementation phase of the PHPC, and these include: 1, ensuring alignment and non-duplication of international, regional, and national efforts through bilateral and multilateral engagement. 2, an iterative process was undertaken to develop the draft protocols for the PHPC, given the need to balance the various national interests from members as well as varied national responses to COVID-19. 3, balancing the need for urgency and the need for due diligence and risk management. And 4, financing and resourcing the Pacific humanitarian partner for COVID-19. Now, in order to overcome these challenges, the Secretary had to make sure that the right people were available to provide the right advice as a trust-building mechanism to achieve consensus within the task force. There were several key factors that contributed to the region overcoming these challenges, which resulted in the successful establishment and effective implementation of the PHPC. Now, I've identified 7 key factors. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go over all of them, but I'll just share 3 with us today. The first one is political leadership. The conducive political environment provided through the invocation of the Bikataw Declaration and the regional policy setting established through the Bikataw and the Boy Declaration enabled the region to mobilize quickly and work towards a political settlement. Leaders were quick to appreciate the immense risk posed by the pandemic to vulnerable public health systems. For once, the tyranny of distance was in our favor, buying us very little time to prepare. Any endeavor of this kind across one of the world's surface with 18 unique countries and territories requires a lot of patience, with the focus that the region is stronger together. Members were able to cast aside political differences to agree and make the PHPC work. Secondly, the use of participatory performance systems, performance tracking and systems thinking. Now, through the regional task force, the region and all stakeholders were able to monitor and evaluate the impact of assistances that members were getting. The Joint Incident Management Team, through the World Health Organization and SPC, provided tracking in terms of the needs of members with regards to their health preparedness and response. The World Food Programme took care of the logistics, including flight arrangements, clearances, working with relevant stakeholders in terms of cargo that needs to be moved. The Secretariat provided support to the WFS directly to members if needed on clearances, if there are any medical or humanitarian cargo that members wanted to move outside of the UN support system. And members provided feedback to the task force meeting on their needs, on what their needs are and how the services could be improved. This in turn further strengthened the culture of trust and participation, which was systematically built into the partnership from the conceptual phase of the establishment of the PHPC. And lastly, a good supporting network of actors. The PHPC delivered because of strong and willing supporting network of actors. The flexibility around the arrangements for the membership of task force meant that new members joined when the need for the involvement around logistics or any other requirements for the PHPC was identified. The supportive environment provided by members meant that any of the stakeholders engaged with the implementation of the PHPC can go directly to them to seek clearances or clarification rather than having to go through people. Lastly, the task force ability to navigate a local context in which the partnership operates assisted the team greatly in managing the relationship established with the PHPC. But the PHPC is living proof that genuine partnerships can lead to better outcomes and tangible outcomes. Having discussed the challenges and how the PHPC partnership was able to overcome it, I felt that it would be remiss of me to highlight a particular aspect of the initiative that would have improved its delivery. The PHPC had successfully provided support to members where it was originally intended. However, the Secretariat felt that it was limited in terms of additional support it could have provided to members because of the absence of a sustainable funding model. The task force relied entirely on the financial assistance and resources provided by donors and partners. And from time to time, the PHPC was not able to provide additional assistances required by members simply because it did not have the resources and funding to do so. It is very important that any future collective response efforts must have a sustainable funding mechanism to ensure that it is able to achieve better outcomes and tangible impacts. Unfortunately, I am out of time to start. In closing, I just want to highlight that we have learned a lot from the region's collective response to COVID-19. Last week we had a FOC subcommittee on regional security meeting, whereby members considered the paper on the PHPC and how we can leverage off the key lessons learned from this initiative, building of the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. A full review of the PHPC will be undertaken in 2023. to look at where we had gone right and identify loopholes that we can continue to work on to strengthen our regional response efforts. The development of a regional HCDR coordination mechanism, the development of a regional pandemic preparedness and response plan, and having a flexible and responsive security architecture are some of the areas that the region will capitalize on with regards to the key issues. Thank you again to the workshop organizers for the opportunity to provide a practitioner's perspective on the region's response to the pandemic. And I'm happy to respond to any queries our participants might have. Without volume.
Thank you very much. And it's remiss of me not to say that we're sorry that you're not here with us in Canberra today. Although, given the weather, I think we'd probably prefer to be in Suva. Now, we've got plenty of time for questions. So, Alma has the roving mic. So, what I would ask is that if you could please introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then if you could please keep to a brief question so that we can share as broad a discussion as possible amongst everyone. So, please hand it over to questions now. Thank you. Yes, at the back here. Sorry,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm a Hicks member of the public. And my question is to Georgia. You commented about the importance of workforce training and coming back as a part of the response to the health crisis. Could you push that further and suggest maybe that labour mobility schemes that see migration of skilled workers out of the Pacific are in fact a threat to human security in the Pacific? Is that a fair summation, or is that pushing the argument too far?
Thank you for your question. I think it's definitely a fair thing to say, but then acknowledging that there's lots of things at play when we are having that movement of people out of the Pacific, because I can speak for a lot of people whose family were migrants from the Pacific, that places such as New Zealand and Australia are sort of viewed as the land of milk and honey, and so then you often have a movement of people out of the Pacific because it's recognised that opportunities are different in larger countries. And so then I think that yes, upskilling people in the Pacific and then getting them into larger countries can be seen as I feel like a detriment's kind of a big word to the community, but then also the consideration of things like repatriation, people coming to bigger countries and then sending money back home and sending resources back home. And so I think it's something that there's going to have to be a very fine balance to strike there, and possibly ensuring that there are schemes that, you have a balance of people moving out and a balance of people moving in, because speaking as someone in the medical school program, we have a very strong incentive for everyone to remain in New Zealand. And they're like, the New Zealand healthcare system's suffering, you need to stay here and pay your dues back here. But then we have a lot of Pacific Island students who recognise that our duties, yes, are to our community in New Zealand, but also to our communities back home. And so, I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Yeah, just to quickly add on to that. A lot of the Pacific economies, they rely on remittance, which is a significant source of income. In the last few years, because of the large number of people moving to New Zealand and Australia through the labour scheme, there have been issues in relation to some villages in Fiji, for instance, have complained about all the young men and women moving out. Some employers, they're beginning to run out of people in the workforce, some of the areas of the economy in Fiji, and they're beginning to hire people from Asia, from Bangladesh and Philippines and other places, because a lot of them are coming to Australia. So yes, remittance is a good source of income. At the same time, the long-term sustainability in relation to well-being and human security in the Pacific, something to be looked at as well. In New Zealand, I attended this big conference on labour mobility 3 or 4 weeks ago, And there have been criticisms about the way in which some of them actually treated like semi-slaves. There was a television program which basically talked about the fact that a lot of them live in squalor conditions, and conditions were terrible. So a lot of those issues have emerged, and something which have to be looked at as well.
Yes, please. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you very much. They were very good, excellent presentations. I have a question because the previous question there just sparks a news article that was on, I think it was ABC yesterday. I can't open it because of my internet, but the title is Pacific Hospitals Suffer Nursing Shortages as Workers Leave for Australia's Labour Scheme. So that strikes me like a huge policy issue and a concern. And Russell is just opening that. It's not really a question, but maybe comment on that.
Thank you. Georgia, would you like to comment on that, Sean?
Yeah, I haven't seen the article, but yeah, it doesn't surprise me. There's nursing shortages, I think we can see everywhere, and it seems to be every day we've got stories about EDs overrun and unfortunate events happening in hospitals because of our shortages. And so I think that while we can understand that there's issues with the movement of people, such as out of our Pacific Islands into bigger countries, even if they move out to Australia, still in Australia, there's a shortage of workforce. And so I think that there's only so much we can do to stop the movement of our healthcare workforce around the globe. There's also just the understanding of we need to just increase the workforce, and that would in some ways help buffer these effects. And we do, I think there would have to be some very large discussions with bigger countries such as New Zealand and Australia to say that we understand you guys have a significant amount of resources and things to offer compared to our Pacific Island countries, but there is a duty to recognise that you can't just keep pulling workers into areas of bigger resource. But yeah, overall I think that if we increase the ability to get people into professions such as nursing, optometry, physio and medicine, through making it a more accessible program to people, then that in some ways would buffer these issues that we have.
Yes.
Commissioner South.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Hilary Petana, High Commissioner of Samoa. The issue of labour mobility is currently being under discussion between our respective governments, particularly with Australia, under the new Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. And I think what we've seen is that there's been a big shift. Originally, these schemes were set up for unemployed and low skilled. The first one of which was set up in 2012, Seasonal Workers Program, and it was basically agriculture. Now it's been expanded to 1 to 4 years of contracts under the Pacific Labour Scheme, and it's gone out to meat processing and hospitality sector, as well as the aged care sector. So the concerns that most of us now, High Commissioners in the Pacific, are voicing to the Australian government is this. Basically, we are going to be looking at serious shortages in our own respective countries. Secondly, it's expanding the program to bring in not just meat processing, but other forms of processing that is linked to the agriculture sector, and that's poultry, piggery. Now, on the aged care, this is a serious concern with us. You've just voiced it. And the way the APTC, or the Australian Pacific technical centers that have been set up for training are now focusing on skills, selective skills to be trained for this is a real concern. Because you are actually now moving into key sectors where at the end of the day, we will be running short of our own people, skilled people. In fact, one of the reasons why Samoa has slowed down its own program of sending people, it's not only to review the entire scheme as to the benefits, but secondly, people were able to come under the radar, our radar, of professionals, policemen, teachers, and nurses who were able to come out on this. On the other side of the coin, we're still negotiating with a lot of issues, serious issues, accommodation, non-access to superannuation funds. There are people who came here in 2012 and 2018 who have gone back and up to now have not been able to access the particular portion of their funds that were contributed to the superannuation here. New Zealand has actually allowed us to be able to access those funds. But at the moment, legislation here doesn't allow that. There's still a lot of issues concerning social significance to the workers here in Australia. So there's a lot of groundwork to be done. And now, there's upping the number to 35,000, which is the target, and that is considerable for the Pacific itself. So there are issues that we're continuing to look at, talking to the Australian government. But it's, these schemes started in 2012, and the second one in 2018. We are in 2022, but there's not been much movement in some of these things. I have been to a number of these accommodations where people are packed into rooms, 4, 6, even 10 to a room. And the quality of the conditions in which they live is just unbelievable. So these are the kind of things that we need to look at. And from our perspective, from the Pacific perspective, it's also looking at the governments themselves in terms of the policy setting. I mean, we've all been saying private sector is the engine for growth. But in most of the Pacific countries, private sector is not exactly seen to be that growth because of weak economic policies or poor economic policies. So there's no employment generation or creation going on in the Pacific Islands to be able to say to our people, we offer you this, we can offer you that. Education is a key to do so. And that isn't happening across the Pacific in terms of lifting the levels of education to be able to improve on skills and also administration within the country. Now coming back to COVID, I think that in Samoa's case, we were fortunate that our public sector reforms back in the mid-90s allowed for a strengthened administration. So it was the all leadership from the top right down to the levels, and why there was much more efficient management of assistance to the country when the COVID rolled out. And I must commend our bilateral partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and even WHO, as well as our regional organizations who really did work together in terms of driving that rollout across the Pacific. A lot of resources and redeployment all over the place, whether it was human capital, equipment, as well as the vaccines themselves. So there was a tremendous effort that was made, and that has to be recognized. But also, it's to do with the countries themselves in taking leadership when these disaster strikes as to whether you set up for them. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Dr. Lava High Commissioner, thank you very much for your important contribution. You've given us a great deal to think about, so thank you. Yes.
G'day, my name's David Homsch. I represent the Australian Defence Force. My role at the moment is the J5, which is Director for Campaigning within our Operational Command, Headquarters Joint Operations Command. Firstly, just in relation to those last few questions, I'm married to a nurse, so I can't speak for the Australian Government or the Defence Force in this respect, but having been married for almost 20 years, I do recognise that she went through a stage of burnout, which I think we're seeing in the Australian community. And where she went looking at that stage was roles overseas. And at the time, I think for her in the early 2000s, it was typical for her to look for a high-paying job, places like the Middle East. But I don't think we should forget the traditional roles of some of the NGOs that work traditionally in the Pacific. I'm familiar with particularly the Missionaries Program, the Peace Corps, the traditional roles of providing teachers, educators, nurses, and the ability to provide funding for those staff, for those people that are burnt out and looking for that terrific opportunity to go and live in the Southwest Pacific and enjoy some of that fine culture. And so the glass could be half full, and so I am forever, as a planner, an optimist rather than a pessimist. And I see great opportunity if the NGO community can step up to actually continue to encourage that type of reciprocated teaching, nursing, construction work under those traditional partnerships. So sorry, I'll get back to my question. I guess from a defence perspective and coming back to COVID, I'm really interested to understand whether there was any fracturing or negative impact from strategic competition through COVID, in particular recognising that some nations chose to partner with Sino vaccinations supported by China, others traditionally focused on those provided by the US and the EU, our other vaccinations. I wonder if you might comment on whether you saw any fracturing or complication created by that strategic competition through COVID in where countries sought to seek their support.
Thank you. Perhaps if we could start with Terrio, actually, with the forum to comment on that. Terry.
Thank you very much for the question. I guess, I mean, from a peace perspective, there was a geopolitical angle in terms of the assistances that we were able to provide. But having said that, in terms of our experiences, for example, a lot of the assistances that we were receiving from private organizations were coming through the Forum Secretariat, from the organizations within China, were coming through the Forum Secretariat in terms of utilization of the PHPC for their distribution within the region. But having said that, given the limited options that some of our members had in terms of access to vaccines and all the other health supplies that were needed, a lot of the assistance that were provided by countries outside of the region really came in at the request of the members. And that included not only access to supplies but vaccination as well. But in saying that, the PHPC was established in a way that we were able to monitor what our members were getting, but also in terms of what came through the PHPC to ensure that that it was in alignment to the requirements of the safety requirements that the WHO had put in terms of the assistances that we were giving our members. But in saying that, the evidence of geopolitical tensions happening in the region, particularly within our members, was evident during the COVID-19 period.
Would either of you like to comment on that?
Would you like to start?
No, I think you can just
Yeah, very good question. In fact, what we saw was the COVID was sitting on top of pre-existing geopolitics anyway, in different ways, the climate issue as well. The global level, of course, the way in which vaccines were being framed, the same vaccine, And in fact, interestingly, Cuba also produced 3 or 4 different vaccines. But because of the geopolitical position of Cuba outside the, if you like, on the margins of the global community, particularly the US sanction and all those things, not many people knew about it in many ways. So there was different layers of geopolitical contestation. One is the pre-existing China versus the so-called West on one hand, and also the global North versus the global South. The long queue to get the COVID vaccination was pretty long and was very difficult to get into the queue. And the big Western countries were able to get there first, were able to monopolize the distribution. And thanks to Australia and New Zealand, the Pacific Island countries who were right at the back of the queue were able to get the share as well. So, and then you have in Asia itself, it was pretty obvious in the way in which the politicization of vaccine and of COVID-19 played out. So yeah, it played into the pre-existing geostrategic contestation in various ways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. James.
Thank you. This is James Batley from AMU, and thanks to all of the speakers this morning. Terrio, this is probably a question for you, but I just wanted to dig a little deeper into the way that the humanitarian pathway was established. And I'm just wondering, were there difficult decisions, political decisions that leaders and governments had to take, or was it a very straightforward process? Did everyone just say, yep, we need to cooperate? How did that work in practice?
Thank you for the question, James. I think a lot of the discussions were going on at the technical level in terms of the development of the protocols. So when I said that there was an iterative process taken to develop the protocols, even though it took 3 months for us to agree on the protocols, we had to convene a number of meetings with the task force and also of the ministerial election group to ensure that we were able to come to an amicable solution in terms of the best way forward. A lot of the proposals in terms of the drafting of the protocols that they were initially drafted by technical agencies, which includes the regional technical agencies, the immigration development community, the Oceania Customs Organization. So when the protocols were drafted, they were purely from a technical perspective in terms of how they were developed. But when they were presented to the members, that's where the intense conversation happened around, how does it apply to existing national platforms and also national mechanisms. And I think that was where a lot of the difficult discussions happened in terms of, what are the minimum conditions that are required for members to sign on to the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway for COVID-19. We were almost having regional task force meetings on a weekly basis just to ensure that we provided a compromise in terms of how do we balance national interest versus the interest of the collective in terms of trying to stand up the PHPC. A lot of difficult conversations, but in the end, what we settled for was minimum conditions or the minimum protocols in terms of how members can sign in. And then on top of that, national policies and protocols could be observed in terms of the application around the management of the assistance that we're going to be provided to the PHPC.
Sharon, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Terrio, and this is a question for you. I guess just reflecting on the vastness of the humanitarian system in the Pacific, and something that we need to consider quite often when we deal with disasters and other humanitarian crises. Building on your last intervention, how did the protocols that were being developed utilize the existing humanitarian protocols and systems? Because there are, several pillars that actually resonate with the human security pillars, such as protection, etc. And what would be some lessons learned in terms of adapting the PHPC in the context of climate related disasters, given that we can anticipate more local and national disasters, not just cyclones, but floods and associated health crises? Naka.
No, thank you for the question. No, as we sit here today, the Pacific humanitarian, the Pacific Human Security Strategies, which covered only the period from 2012 to 2015, has expired in terms of its effectiveness because it has expired. But in terms of the region going forward, we understand and we notice the comments that have been made, and we agree with you that there's a lot to learn from the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway for COVID-19 in terms of how we were able to assist, particularly from a human security perspective. And if you believe you at the beginning of the presentation that I made, I highlighted that the invocation of the establishment of the regional response was really established under the two of the declarations that we have. One is the initiation of a regional response under the Big Top Declaration. And the second one was the classification and the identification of human insecurity as a security issue in terms of a strategic focus area of the Boy Declaration, and classifying health security, health issues as a human security. So that was where the Boy Declaration, we were able to identify the pandemic as a health security, and we were able to invoke the Big Health Declaration to develop the regional response. No, but having said that, there are also work that are currently being undertaken by the region, and that will be prioritized in the year 2023 around the review of the regional human security framework, which expired in